I raised my son to be a man of unwavering character, but at his rehearsal dinner my future daughter-in-law slid a property transfer deed across the white linen tablecloth. She demanded I sign over my only home in front of 40 guests or be permanently banned from their lives. I looked at my son for help, but he just stared at his plate. That was the exact moment my heart shattered into a million pieces, and the very moment I decided they would learn a devastating lesson they would never forget. My name is Caroline. I am 68 years old, and for my entire professional life I worked as a high school literature teacher. I spent 4 decades analyzing the great tragedies of Shakespeare and the moral failings of classic protagonists, never once imagining I would find myself living in the center of one. My husband, a kind and deeply pragmatic man, passed away 5 years ago, leaving me a widow in the quiet 4-bedroom suburban home we had purchased when we were young and full of hope. After his passing, my universe shrank down to my garden, my books, and my only son, Thomas. Thomas was my absolute pride. I remember waking up at 4 a.m, sitting at our kitchen island with a red pen, grading hundreds of student essays, just so I could afford to send him to a prestigious university without drowning him in student loans. I sacrificed new clothes vacations and countless hours of sleep to ensure he had a solid, debt-free foundation to build his life upon. I thought I had raised an independent, strong, and honorable man. I was entirely wrong. We were gathered at the Whispering Pines Country Club for the rehearsal dinner. The private dining room was a blinding display of manufactured opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh, glittering light over the tables. The air was thick with the overpowering scent of expensive perfumes and roasted filet mignon. I sat near the head of the long table, wearing a modest tailored navy dress that I had purchased from a department store 5 years ago. I felt profoundly out of place, clutching my glass of sparkling water, observing the absolute chaos of my future daughter-in-law's family. Victoria the woman. Thomas was to marry the following afternoon, was a master of artificial charm. She wore a heavily beaded designer dress that caught the light with every calculated movement. Her family dominated the room with an aggressive, suffocating energy. They laughed entirely too loudly, clinked their champagne flutes with obnoxious force, and bragged constantly about luxury European vacations and elite social connections. I sat in quiet dignity, listening to her father loudly boasting to the waiters about his supposed corporate conquests. I knew their type. Having spent my life around real wealth and quiet intellectuals, I recognized the hollow performance of people desperate to project a high society status that they did not truly possess. They were loud because they needed everyone to believe they mattered. But what broke my heart was not the obnoxious behavior of Victoria's family. It was the sight of my son. Thomas sat next to Victoria, physically shrinking into his heavy mahogany chair. The confident, articulate young man I had raised was completely gone. In his place was a hollow shadow, a subservient puppet who nodded frantically at every demand Victoria made. When she snapped her fingers for a waiter, Thomas flinched. When her mother made a condescending remark about the venue's floral arrangements, Thomas aggressively agreed entirely, abandoning his own opinions. He was terrified of displeasing them. He was desperately trying to blend into a shallow, materialistic world that only valued his absolute compliance. I watched my son trade his hard-earned dignity for the shallow affection of a woman who viewed him not as a partner, but as a financial stepping stone. The dinner service was coming to an end. The waiters moved silently through the room, clearing the heavy china plates and replacing them with decadent chocolate desserts. The room hummed with the loud, abrasive chatter of Victoria's relatives. Suddenly, the chaotic noise was pierced by a sharp, rhythmic sound. Victoria stood up abruptly. She grabbed a silver spoon and tapped it aggressively against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing cut through the air, demanding absolute attention. The 40 guests immediately fell silent, turning their expectant faces toward the bride. Victoria smiled. It was a bright, predatory smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. She projected her voice so that every single person in the room could hear her perfectly. She began by thanking her parents for their generosity, then shifted her gaze directly onto me. She announced that she was thrilled to officially join my family, and that she wanted to take this public moment to reveal the incredibly generous wedding gift I had supposedly prepared for them to secure their future. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I had already given Thomas and Victoria a substantial check for $5,000, a sum that had taken me months to save from my teacher's pension. I had no idea what she was talking about. Victoria did not break eye contact. Without losing her manicured smile, she reached down into the oversized designer tote bag resting by her feet. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. She slammed it onto the white linen tablecloth with a violent thud. With a swift, aggressive motion, she pushed the folder hard. The heavy paper skidded past the elaborate floral centerpieces, past the crystal wine glasses, and stopped mere inches from my trembling hands. The entire dining room watched in breathless fascination. Victoria declared loudly that inside that folder was the property transfer deed for my 4-bedroom suburban home. She announced to the stunned audience that I was signing over the entire equity of my house to them, effectively leaving myself homeless so they could use the property as collateral for their new life together. The absolute audacity of her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. My heart began to pound a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My home was my sanctuary. It was the only tangible asset I had left. It was the place where I had marked Thomas's height on the doorframe, where I had nursed my husband through his final days, where every single memory of my life was permanently anchored. And this woman, this stranger, was demanding I surrender it on a silver platter as a twisted wedding tribute. I did not reach for the folder. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to steady my erratic breathing. I looked up at Victoria, waiting for her to laugh, waiting for the punchline of a terribly cruel joke. But there was no joke. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, uncompromising greed. When I did not immediately pick up the pen resting on top of the folder, Victoria leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. Her voice dropped its sweet, performative tone and took on the sharp edge of a razor blade. She delivered a brutal ultimatum loud enough for every guest at the table to hear clearly. She stated that if I did not open that folder and sign over the deed to my home right this exact second, the wedding was officially canceled. Furthermore, she declared that I would be permanently barred from their lives. I would not be allowed at the ceremony tomorrow. I would never be allowed to visit them. I would be completely and entirely cut off, left to rot in isolation for the rest of my days. The suffocating tension in the room was unbearable. 40 wealthy guests stared at me, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. They were waiting for the retired public school teacher to break down, to cry, to beg, or to obediently sign away her life to appease her new high society superiors. The silence stretched heavy and toxic, wrapping around my throat like a vice. I slowly turned my head away from Victoria's glaring eyes. I looked directly at Thomas, my only child, the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to protect. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to push his chair back, to grab his fiancée by the arm, and to defend his mother's honor. I waited for the man I raised to reject this blatant, disgusting extortion happening right in front of his face. Thomas did not move a single muscle. He kept his head completely bowed, his shoulders hunched forward, his hands gripping the edge of the white tablecloth, with white-knuckled intensity. He stared directly down at his half-eaten dessert, absolutely refusing to lift his head or meet my agonizing gaze. His silence was deafening. It was not the silence of shock or confusion. It was the cowardly, deliberate silence of total complicity. He knew. He knew exactly what Victoria was going to do, and he had sat there eating his expensive dinner, waiting for me to be publicly ambushed and bullied into surrendering my home. He was entirely willing to trade my security, my dignity, and my future just to buy his admission into Victoria's hollow, materialistic world. The profound betrayal sliced through my chest, burning hotter than any physical wound I could ever imagine. I did not reach for the heavy manila folder. I did not touch the polished silver pen that Victoria had so aggressively slid across the white linen tablecloth. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling the coarse texture of my napkin beneath my trembling fingers. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the suffocating silence of the private dining room stretch out around us. I watched Victoria's triumphant, predatory smile begin to twitch at the corners when I failed to burst into tears or blindly reach for the document. I looked at the 40 faces surrounding us. Wealthy socialites, country club members, and distant relatives were all staring at me, waiting for the modest retired schoolteacher to bow her head and surrender the only sanctuary she had left in this world. I picked up my linen napkin. With careful, precise movements, I folded it into a perfect square and placed it beside my untouched plate. I looked directly into Victoria's cold, calculating eyes and spoke with the clear, projecting voice I had used to command classrooms full of unruly teenagers for 40 years. I told her that the home where I had nursed my husband until his dying breath was not an item on her wedding registry. I stated firmly, and without a shred of hesitation, that I would not be signing over the deed to my property. Not tonight, not tomorrow, and not ever. The collective gasp from the guests was audible. The polite ambient murmur of the room died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Victoria's fake smile snapped into a tight, furious line. Her eyes widened in genuine shock, entirely unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Before she could launch another verbal assault, the screech of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back echoed through the room. Victoria's father, a man named Preston, stood up at the opposite end of the long table. He was a broad-shouldered man with a red face, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my annual pension. He straightened his expensive silk tie and scoffed loudly, a sound dripping with unmistakable condescension. Preston projected his voice, ensuring every single guest in the room could hear his brutal classist insult. He announced that I was being incredibly short-sighted and deeply ungrateful. He stated that a retired public school teacher should consider it a rare and profound privilege to contribute something of actual financial value to a family of their superior societal stature. He mocked my modest suburban lifestyle, implying that my financial stability was nothing but a minor fluke. He declared that turning over my property was the absolute bare minimum I could do to ensure my son was accepted into their refined lineage. He finished his tirade by stating that I was actively holding Thomas back from his true potential among the city's elite, and that I should be thanking them for elevating my son out of his mediocre background. The sheer naked disrespect hit me like a physical blow. The room held its breath, waiting for my reaction. I had spent 4 decades navigating parent-teacher conferences with arrogant individuals who believed their wealth made them exempt from basic human decency. I knew exactly how to handle men who mistook quiet restraint for weakness. I did not scream. I did not hurl defensive insults across the crystal centerpieces, and I did not shed a single tear for their amusement. Arguments are for people who require external validation, and I required absolutely none from this room full of vultures. I pushed my heavy mahogany chair back and stood up to my full height. The entire room watched in stunned, breathless silence as I casually buttoned my conservative navy jacket. I looked at Preston, allowing a fraction of a second of pure, unfiltered pity to show in my eyes before turning my gaze back to my son. Thomas was completely frozen, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He had allowed another man to publicly degrade his mother, and he had done absolutely nothing to stop it. I did not utter a single word of goodbye. I simply turned on my heel and walked the length of the dining room with measured, deliberate steps. The sound of my sensible shoes clicking against the polished marble floor was the only noise in the cavernous space. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors and stepped out of the banquet hall, letting the doors close with a heavy final thud behind me, leaving the entire room to marinate in their own toxic shock. The cool evening air of the country club hit my face, offering a sharp, grounding contrast to the suffocating artificiality I had just escaped. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my shoes as I crossed the dimly lit parking lot toward my reliable 10-year-old sedan. I felt a strange, terrifying mixture of profound sorrow and absolute clarity. The public humiliation they had attempted to inflict upon me had crossed a permanent, unforgivable boundary. Just as I reached into my purse for my car keys, the heavy oak doors of the country club slammed open. Fast, aggressive footsteps hurried across the pavement in my direction. I did not alter my pace or look back. I placed my hand on the driver's side door handle just as Thomas finally caught up to me. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed an angry, blotchy red against the crisp white collar of his custom tuxedo. I stopped and turned to him. A foolish maternal part of my heart expected an apology. I expected my son to express profound shame for the spectacle his future wife and her arrogant father had just orchestrated. I expected him to beg for my forgiveness for failing to defend me. Instead, Thomas planted himself directly between me and my car door, his eyes wide with a frantic, accusing energy. He demanded to know why I had deliberately humiliated Victoria in front of her entire extended family. He accused me of being stubborn, selfish, and completely failing to understand the delicate social dynamics of the wealthy world he was trying to secure a place in. I stood perfectly still, watching the erratic, panicked movements of his hands. I asked him with a voice dangerously quiet why a wealthy family needed a retired teacher's modest home so desperately. Thomas lowered his voice to a harsh, desperate whisper, glancing over his shoulder toward the club entrance. He confessed the devastating truth. The deed to my suburban home was not merely a symbolic wedding gift to appease Victoria. They desperately needed the physical equity of my property to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. He admitted that Victoria's parents were not the billionaires they pretended to be. Preston's import business was actively failing, drowning in massive federal tax liens and aggressive creditor demands. Thomas revealed that he and Victoria needed my house as immediate collateral to secure a $2 million loan to fund the extravagant wedding payoff the vendors, who were threatening to walk out tomorrow and inject emergency capital into Preston's sinking company. He ordered me to stop being difficult and hand over the deed to save his future, claiming that he would eventually pay off the loan and return the house to me once their new joint business ventures became profitable. The sheer undeniable entitlement radiating from his words stripped away the last remaining illusion I had of my son. He was not asking for a motherly favor. He was demanding the absolute surrender of my life's safety net to fund a manufactured fraudulent facade. I realized in that exact heartbreaking moment that Thomas was entirely complicit in this extortion. He knew exactly what Victoria planned to do at the dinner table. He had known for weeks. He had cowardly stared at his dessert plate while they ambushed me because he was entirely willing to trade my survival for his admission into their hollow world. He grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. He told me that I needed to adapt, that Victoria's family operated on a superior level of influence, and that I was actively ruining his only chance at real success. I looked down at his hand gripping my jacket. The heartbreak inside me condensed into something cold, heavy, and unbreakable. I firmly detached his fingers from my arm and took a step back. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not utter a single word of condemnation. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob, pulled the heavy car door open, and slid into the driver's seat. I pulled the door shut and locked it securely. The mechanical click sounding incredibly loud in the quiet parking lot. I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I watched Thomas shouting on the curb, violently throwing his hands up in a theatrical display of frustration and rage. I put the car in gear and drove away, leaving the boy I had raised standing alone in the dark, surrounded entirely by the empty prestige of the country club. The drive back to my quiet neighborhood was a blur of passing streetlights and shifting shadows. I gripped the steering wheel with hands that were finally entirely steady. The hot tears of betrayal had stopped falling somewhere between the country club parking lot and the highway on-ramp. I pulled into my driveway and parked in front of the modest 4-bedroom suburban home Thomas and Victoria were so incredibly desperate to steal. I walked through the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The familiar silence of the house wrapped around my shoulders, but it no longer felt like a lonely space. It felt like an impenetrable fortress. I walked directly into my late husband's study. I turned on the small brass desk lamp and stared at the framed photograph of the two of us from our early years together. My husband had been a quiet man who drove a reliable second-hand sedan and wore simple off-the-rack suits to church on Sundays. But behind that unassuming exterior lay an absolutely brilliant financial mind. He had been a silent partner in several highly lucrative commercial real estate developments across the state. Over our decades together, we had amassed a vast portfolio of properties, and a multi-million-dollar fortune. We had placed every single asset into an ironclad blind trust managed by a premier wealth management firm. We made a conscious, deliberate decision never to tell Thomas about the true extent of our wealth. We wanted him to understand the value of honest labor. We wanted him to build his own character and his own legacy, not wait around idly for a trust fund to finance a life of leisure. The house I lived in and the modest teacher's pension I publicly claimed were merely a fraction of a percent of my actual net worth. I picked up the telephone on the desk and dialed the direct private number of my estate attorney, Mr. Sterling. It was nearly midnight, but he answered on the second ring. I did not waste a single second apologizing for calling at such a late hour. I told him exactly what had transpired at the rehearsal dinner. I recounted the public humiliation, the aggressive demand for the property deed, and the sickening revelation in the parking lot where my son admitted he needed my house as collateral for a massive commercial bridge loan to save Victoria's bankrupt family. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mr. Sterling had known Thomas since he was a little boy playing with toy trucks in our backyard. The sheer scale of the betrayal shocked him deeply. I told Mr. Sterling that my time for weeping was officially over. I ordered him to initiate an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of my entire public-facing financial footprint. I needed to know exactly how Thomas and Victoria had managed to get a commercial loan application to the final stages of approval using a residential property they did not legally own. I authorized him to pull my credit reports, investigate any hard inquiries on my Social Security number, and trace the digital origin of whatever loan documents had been filed with the lenders. Mr. Sterling warned me with a grave tone that opening this door might reveal things I was not emotionally prepared to see. I told him I had just watched my only child trade my survival for a country club membership, and that I was prepared for absolutely anything. He promised to utilize his firm's emergency resources through the night and be at my door at sunrise. I did not sleep a single minute. I sat at my kitchen island drinking bitter black coffee and watching the darkness outside my window slowly fade into the gray light of dawn. I felt a cold, calculated clarity settling over my mind. The mother who would have blindly given her last breath for her son died in that country club parking lot. In her place was a formidable woman preparing to fiercely protect her legacy and her dignity. At exactly 6 a.m, the headlights of a luxury sedan swept across my living room wall. Mr. Sterling stepped out of his vehicle carrying a thick leather briefcase. I opened the front door and let him inside. He looked completely exhausted from working through the night, but his eyes were sharp and filled with a grim, undeniable determination. He placed his briefcase on the kitchen counter and snapped the brass locks open. He pulled out a thick stack of banking reports and laid them flat on the granite surface in front of me. He told me that what he had found went far beyond simple generational entitlement or aggressive greed. He stated that Thomas and Victoria had explicitly crossed the line into severe federal crime. He slid a printed document across the counter. It was a digital copy of an application for a $2 million commercial bridge loan filed with one of the largest national banks in the country. The primary collateral listed on the application to secure the massive debt was my exact home address. I asked Mr. Sterling how they could possibly originate a commercial loan on a house that was entirely and exclusively in my name. He pulled out the next document and my blood ran ice cold. It was a highly detailed, durable power of attorney. The legal document explicitly granted Thomas absolute executive control over my real estate portfolio and my personal finances. I looked at the bottom of the page. There on the primary signature line was my name. It was a flawless forgery. Someone had meticulously copied the loops and specific angles of my handwriting. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a wave of absolute sickening revulsion. Thomas had watched me grade student essays at this very kitchen counter for years. He knew my handwriting better than anyone else on earth. He had weaponized that intimate knowledge to steal my home and strip me of my independence. Mr. Sterling explained the exact mechanics of their desperate scheme. They had uploaded the forged power of attorney to the bank's digital portal to push the loan through the initial underwriting process. The bank had approved the funds in theory based entirely on the fraudulent paperwork. However, the underwriting department had flagged one final mandatory requirement. They needed the physical original deed to the house, along with a fresh notarized signature from me to clear escrow and release the $2 million into their accounts. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. That was exactly why Victoria had ambushed me at the rehearsal dinner. They needed to terrorize me into signing the physical transfer deed in front of 40 wealthy witnesses to finalize the felony before their wedding day. If they failed to produce the deed by the end of the business day, the bank would reject the loan entirely, and their financial facade would instantly collapse. The sheer arrogance of their calculated plan was staggering. They had built a massive financial house of cards entirely dependent on my silent, obedient submission. They assumed I was just a naive retired teacher who would sign anything to keep the peace and avoid a public scene. I looked at Mr. Sterling and gave him my next set of absolute directives. For over a decade, I had maintained a secondary emergency credit card in Thomas's name attached to my public checking account to help him with minor unexpected expenses. I ordered Mr. Sterling to freeze that specific account immediately and permanently cancel the physical card. I knew Thomas was relying on that exact line of credit to fund the final vendor payments for the extravagant wedding venue today. By cutting it off, I was pulling the primary support beam out from under their entire celebration. Then I gave my final instruction. I told Mr. Sterling to contact the bank's Central Fraud Department immediately. I wanted him to provide their federal compliance officers with the absolute proof of the forged power of attorney. But I gave him one explicit, uncompromising condition. He was to instruct the bank to flag the file internally for federal wire fraud and bank fraud, but they were not to change the outward status on the client-facing portal. I did not want Thomas or Victoria to receive an automated digital alert that the loan had been officially rejected. I wanted the trap to remain completely silent and entirely invisible. I wanted them to walk into their extravagant wedding day entirely convinced they had successfully outsmarted me while actually walking straight into a massive federal investigation. Mr. Sterling nodded, recognizing the absolute devastation of the strategy. He packed his documents back into his briefcase and went to his car to execute the calls. I remained in my quiet kitchen, waiting for the sun to rise fully, knowing that the financial foundation holding up my son's entire existence had just been completely and permanently demolished. The morning of the wedding arrived with a heavy gray sky that perfectly matched the cold resolve settling over my heart. I was standing in my quiet kitchen pouring a fresh cup of coffee when the violent pounding on my front door shattered the silence. It was barely 8 in the morning. The aggressive rhythm of the knocking was unmistakable. I did not rush. I walked slowly to the entryway, smoothing my slacks and taking a deep, steadying breath. Through the decorative glass panes, I could see the frantic silhouettes of Victoria and her mother Cynthia. They had not come for a polite morning visit. They had come to collect their ransom. Before I opened the door, I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan. I unlocked my smartphone, navigated to the voice memo application, and pressed record. I dropped the device back into my pocket, ensuring the microphone was completely unobstructed. The device vibrated once against my hip, confirming it was actively capturing audio. I reached out and pulled the heavy mahogany door open. Victoria pushed past me without a single word of greeting. She marched directly into my living room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. She was dressed in an expensive silk tracksuit, clutching the same thick manila folder she had weaponized at the rehearsal dinner. Cynthia followed closely behind her, radiating a toxic combination of wealthy entitlement and raw desperation. Their timeline was actively collapsing. The commercial bank required the physical deed and my notarized signature to release the $2 million before the wedding ceremony began. Victoria threw the folder onto my coffee table with a vicious thud. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and glared at me. She dropped her sweet performative voice entirely. She told me that I had exactly 1 minute to sign the transfer deed, or they were going to make my life a living nightmare. She claimed the bank was waiting for the final document upload, and my selfish stubbornness was actively destroying her perfect day. I stood near the sofa, keeping my posture intentionally small and submissive. I allowed my shoulders to slump and my hands to tremble slightly. I needed them to believe their intimidation tactics were working flawlessly. I asked her why she was doing this to me. I let my voice waver, pitching it to sound like a terrified, confused older woman who simply did not understand the modern world. Cynthia stepped forward, invading my personal space. She looked down her nose at me with a sneer of absolute disgust. She declared that I was completely losing my mind. She told me that Thomas had confided in them about my erratic behavior. She fabricated a series of outrageous lies right to my face. She claimed I had been leaving the gas stove on overnight, wandering the neighborhood in my nightgown, and forgetting the names of my own relatives. She stated with absolute chilling confidence that I was a severe danger to myself and an unbearable burden to my son. Victoria seized the momentum her mother had created. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. She told me that if I refused to sign the property deed right now, they had a medical team on standby. She explicitly stated that her family had powerful connections with local judges and senior services. She threatened to file an emergency petition for mental incompetency before the sun went down. She swore she would have me dragged out of my only home by uniformed officers committed to a miserable state-run psychiatric facility and stripped of all my basic human rights. She smiled a cruel, twisted smile and reminded me that once I was locked away in a ward, Thomas would automatically gain legal control of the house anyway, so my resistance was entirely pointless. The sheer malice in her extortion was breathtaking. They were openly admitting to a conspiracy to commit medical fraud and elder abuse simply to steal my property. My smartphone recorded every single vile syllable of their federal crimes. I forced tears into my eyes, letting them spill over my cheeks. I backed away from them, clutching my hands to my chest. I stammered and cried, begging them not to lock me away in a hospital. I told them I was just scared and that I did not want to lose my home, but I also did not want to lose my son. I played the role of the broken, defeated mother perfectly. I looked at the folder on the table and let out a loud, dramatic sob. I told Victoria that I would sign the document to make them happy, but I could not do it right now. I claimed my hands were shaking too badly and that my vision was blurred from crying. I told her I had left my heavy prescription reading glasses upstairs and could not possibly sign a legally binding document without them. I begged her to give me just a few hours to calm my nerves and read the fine print properly. I promised her with absolute fabricated sincerity that I would bring the signed and notarized folder directly to her private bridal suite at the country club before the wedding ceremony began. Victoria stared at me, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the risk. She glanced at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. The bank's underwriting department was open until noon. The wedding was at 2 p.m. She had just enough time to upload the document if I delivered it to the venue by 11. She grabbed her designer purse and sneered at me. She accepted the delay, but delivered one final brutal warning. She told me that if I was even 1 minute late to the bridal suite, she would personally ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life heavily medicated in a locked room. They turned and marched out of my house, slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled in their frames. The instant the heavy lock clicked into place, my tears vanished completely. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back to release the tension of my performance. I reached into my cardigan pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I stopped the recording and immediately uploaded the pristine high-definition audio file to a secure cloud server. I forwarded a direct copy to Mr. Sterling, along with a brief text message confirming that the bait had been successfully taken and the trap was armed. My phone rang less than a minute later. Mr. Sterling sounded energized, his professional composure sharpened by the thrill of an airtight case. He confirmed receipt of the audio file. He stated that the recording was an absolute goldmine. Victoria and Cynthia had explicitly confessed to extortion, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit medical fraud on tape. The evidence was completely undeniable and utterly devastating. But Mr. Sterling had even better news waiting for me. He informed me that the financial guillotine we had prepared at dawn had just dropped. The automated risk algorithms, triggered by the permanent cancellation of Thomas's emergency credit cards, had officially hit the vendor terminals at the country club. Miles away at the sprawling luxury venue, a catastrophic financial collapse was actively erupting. The massive floral arrangements were halfway unloaded from the delivery trucks when the lead florist ran the platinum card on file for the remaining balance. The transaction returned a harsh red decline code. At the exact same moment, the elite catering director attempted to authorize the massive final payment for the premium open bar and the gourmet dinner service. The terminal rejected the charge completely. The bank had locked the accounts down tight. The venue managers were currently storming the administrative offices demanding immediate cash wires from a family that possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. Thomas was standing in the groom's staging area staring at his declining banking apps, completely paralyzed by a mounting mountain of unpaid invoices. He was banking his entire survival on the illusion that I was driving to the venue to hand over a $2 million property deed to save him. I did not revel in the chaos. I moved with cold mechanical precision. I instructed Mr. Sterling to contact the regional director of the commercial bank immediately. The director was already panicking about the forged power of attorney we had uncovered earlier. Mr. Sterling forwarded the new audio recording directly to the bank's federal compliance team. The recording proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the loan application was not merely a foolish administrative error, but a highly orchestrated criminal conspiracy designed to defraud an elderly woman. The bank immediately escalated the file to the local authorities and federal fraud investigators. Arrest warrants were actively being drafted. Police cruisers were being quietly dispatched to the venue. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened my spacious closet. I bypassed the modest pastel mother of the groom dress Victoria had explicitly ordered me to wear. I reached into the back and pulled out a stunning sharp charcoal suit, tailored perfectly to my frame. It was a suit that commanded respect and demanded attention. It was the armor of a woman who owned commercial buildings and dictated terms to powerful men. I dressed meticulously, pulling my gray hair back into a severe, elegant twist. I applied a bold red lipstick that I had not worn since my husband passed away. I looked in the full-length mirror and saw a formidable woman ready to dismantle an empire of lies. Downstairs, I walked to my husband's heavy oak desk. Mr. Sterling had left a thick red envelope resting on the polished wood. It was sealed with heavy crimson wax. Inside this envelope, there was no property transfer deed. There was no financial rescue. Inside was a formal notice of immediate eviction for the luxury penthouse Thomas and Victoria currently occupied, which was quietly owned by my blind trust. The legal mandate was brutally concise, stating the primary leaseholder had entirely relinquished the financial guarantee. Alongside the eviction notice were copies of the federal fraud indictments that the bank was currently filing against my son for forging my signature. I picked up the red envelope, feeling its satisfying heavy weight in my hands. The trap was perfectly laid and inescapable. Victoria and her arrogant family were currently trapped in a high-society venue surrounded by angry vendors demanding money they simply did not have. They were sweating, stalling, and lying to their wealthy guests, desperately watching the clock for my arrival. They truly believed I was bringing them their salvation on a silver platter. They believed the quiet, retired teacher had been successfully bullied into surrendering her life's work. I picked up my leather handbag and my car keys. I walked out of my front door and locked it securely behind me. I stepped out into the cool morning air, feeling a profound sense of absolute liberation. I was about to drive to the most extravagant wedding of the season, not as a submissive guest, but as the silent architect of their total destruction. I started my car engine and pulled out of the driveway, heading steadily toward the country club, where a room full of arrogant predators was waiting blindly for the guillotine to fall. The drive to the Whispering Pines Country Club was a journey through a world of pristine, manicured lawns and towering oak trees. I pulled my reliable sedan up to the grand entrance where a valet in a crisp white uniform hurried over to open my door. I stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, smoothing the sharp lapels of my charcoal suit. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive cologne. On the surface, the venue looked like a perfect fairy tale. Massive archways of white roses and green ivy framed the heavy mahogany doors. Soft classical music floated from a string quartet playing somewhere in the lush gardens. It was a masterpiece of high society planning designed to project absolute wealth and effortless grace. But as soon as I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, the illusion shattered. The fairy tale facade was nothing but a thin coat of paint over a crumbling, desperate reality. The atmosphere inside the country club was absolutely claustrophobic. It was thick with a hidden, frantic panic that made the air feel heavy. I stood quietly near the entrance, observing the beautiful, cascading floral centerpieces that lined the hallway. They were magnificent displays of orchids and lilies, completely at odds with the ugly, raw greed radiating from the people rushing past them. I immediately spotted Victoria's father, Preston. He was standing near the coat check, completely abandoning his usual arrogant posture. His face was a blotchy shade of purple, and he was aggressively wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled silk handkerchief. He was cornered by two men wearing the venue management uniform, holding thick clipboards and looking entirely unyielding. Preston was whispering frantically, waving his hands in the air, clearly begging for more time. A few feet away, Victoria's mother Cynthia was trying to physically block the path of a furious catering director. The caterer was pointing sharply at a declined transaction receipt, shaking her head with absolute finality. Cynthia looked completely deranged. Her expensive makeup was smudged and her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a miracle. Then Cynthia saw me. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, and she immediately slapped Preston on the shoulder, pointing in my direction. The pure, naked relief that washed over their faces was absolutely nauseating. They did not see Caroline, the mother of the groom. They did not see a human being. They looked directly at my leather handbag and saw their $2 million salvation. They honestly believed I had been broken. They genuinely thought I had driven all the way here to hand over the deed to my home to save their pathetic, fraudulent empire. Preston took a step toward me, adjusting his tie, trying to plaster his fake, wealthy smile back onto his sweating face. But Thomas got to me first. My son appeared from a side corridor, moving with a frantic, jerky energy that bordered on sheer panic. His custom tuxedo looked immaculate, but the man wearing it was completely unraveling. He did not greet me. He did not tell me I looked beautiful. He did not offer a single word of apology for the horrific things he had allowed to happen to me over the past 24 hours. He simply lunged forward and grabbed me tightly by the forearm. His grip was harsh and unforgiving, driven by absolute terror. He pulled me away from the grand foyer, dragging me down a quiet, carpeted hallway, away from the prying eyes of the arriving guests. We passed beautiful antique mirrors and delicate crystal sconces, but Thomas was entirely blind to the luxury he was so desperate to buy his way into. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He marched me down the corridor until we reached a set of heavy white double doors, marked with a silver plaque reading Private Bridal Suite. He pushed the door open, shoved me inside, and quickly locked the deadbolt behind us. The bridal suite was a vision of chaotic luxury. White silk robes were thrown carelessly across velvet chairs. Empty champagne flutes littered the marble countertops. The air was suffocatingly thick with the smell of heavy hairspray, expensive perfume, and pure, unadulterated desperation. Victoria was standing in the center of the room. Her heavily beaded designer wedding gown was only half buttoned. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her face was a mask of furious anxiety. When she saw me walk through the door with Thomas, she let out a sharp breath of relief that quickly hardened back into her usual arrogant entitlement. Thomas stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path to the door. His eyes were wild, darting down to my leather handbag and back up to my face. The sheer terror in his voice was impossible to hide, even as he tried to sound commanding and in control. He demanded the folder. He ordered me to hand over the signed and notarized deed immediately. He claimed the bank managers were waiting on the phone, and the venue directors were threatening to cancel the entire reception in less than 10 minutes. He told me to stop playing games and give them the paperwork before the entire wedding was completely ruined. Victoria stepped up beside him, crossing her arms over the intricate lace of her bodice. She glared at me with absolute contempt, completely dropping the terrified victim act she had tried to pull when she thought her special day was slipping away. She told me I was incredibly lucky they were still allowing me to attend the ceremony after the stress I had caused them all morning. She demanded that I take the deed out of my bag and place it in Thomas's hands, so they could finally put this ridiculous drama behind them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of entitlement and greed. They were entirely convinced they had won. They thought my presence in that claustrophobic suite was the ultimate proof of my submission. They believed they had successfully bullied a retired schoolteacher into funding their fraudulent lifestyle by stealing her only home. I looked at my son, noting the sweat gathering at his temples and the frantic pulse beating in his neck. I looked at the bride, who viewed my total financial ruin as her rightful wedding registry gift. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my calm, composed posture against the backdrop of their beautiful, fragile facade. I reached my hand slowly into my leather bag, wrapping my fingers around the thick, heavy red envelope waiting inside. I slowly withdrew my hand from the depths of my leather handbag. My fingers gripped the smooth, heavy parchment of the thick red envelope Mr. Sterling had prepared for me. I held it out toward my son. The crimson wax seal gleamed under the harsh lighting of the bridal suite. Thomas did not hesitate for a single second. He lunged forward and snatched the envelope from my hands with a greedy, desperate force. His eyes were wide with a manic triumph. He honestly believed he had won. He believed he had successfully broken his own mother and secured his ticket into high society. Victoria crowded right against his shoulder, her face flushed with victorious greed. She watched his hands with hungry anticipation, completely ready to celebrate her ultimate victory over the pathetic retired teacher she despised. Thomas ripped the heavy envelope open, tearing through the wax seal with aggressive impatience. He reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the bold black lettering at the top of the very first page. I watched the exact moment his entire world stopped turning. The arrogant, victorious grin melted right off his face, replaced by a mask of utter, absolute confusion. He blinked hard, staring at the paper as if the words were written in a foreign language. He was looking for a property transfer deed for a 4-bedroom suburban house. Instead, the bold heading across the top of the heavy legal paper read, "Notice of immediate eviction." Victoria leaned in closer, snatching the top page from his trembling hands. Her eyes darted across the text and she let out a sharp, confused gasp. She demanded to know what this was. I stood perfectly straight, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. I looked my son directly in the eyes and delivered the truth in a voice as cold and hard as steel. I told him that the luxury downtown penthouse he and Victoria had been living in for the past 2 years did not belong to a faceless corporate management company. I informed him that my late husband and I had purchased that entire building a decade ago through a blind trust. I told him that I was the sole legal owner of his home, and because he had chosen to forge my signature on federal bank documents, I was officially terminating his lease effective immediately. The air in the room vanished. Thomas physically stumbled backward, his hands shaking so violently the remaining papers fluttered to the marble floor. Victoria let out a high-pitched scream of denial, calling me a liar. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the fallen papers to prove I was making it all up. But as she grabbed the next document, her scream died in her throat. Stamped across the heavy white paper were the official seals of the United States Department of Justice and the Federal Banking Commission. It was a formal notice of criminal indictment for bank fraud, wire fraud, and felony forgery. Thomas looked up at me, his face entirely drained of blood. He looked like a terrified little boy caught in a nightmare he could not wake up from. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to negotiate, but he never got the chance. The heavy white double doors of the private bridal suite burst open with a deafening crash. Mr. Sterling stepped into the room looking like an absolute force of nature. Flanking him on either side were 4 stern men wearing sharp dark suits and displaying heavy gold badges strapped to their belts. They were federal bank fraud investigators accompanied by 3 uniformed local police officers whose radios crackled loudly in the suffocating silence of the suite. The sheer, overwhelming presence of law enforcement completely shattered the luxurious illusion of the wedding day. The lead federal investigator stepped forward, his voice echoing off the crystal mirrors. He looked directly at my son and asked him to confirm his identity. Thomas could not even form a word. He just nodded his head in slow, terrified submission. The investigator did not waste a single second. He announced that Thomas and Victoria were officially under arrest for multiple counts of felony bank fraud and the submission of forged financial documents to a federally insured institution, Victoria shrieked. It was a raw, ugly sound that tore through the elegant room. She backed away toward the vanity mirror, knocking over a tray of expensive champagne flutes. The crystal shattered across the floor in a rain of glass and spilled wine. She screamed that she was the bride, that it was her wedding day, and that they were ruining her perfect moment. A female police officer stepped over the broken glass, grabbed Victoria by the arm, and spun her around. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around the wrists of the bride echoed through the room like a gunshot. Another officer grabbed Thomas, pulling his arms firmly behind his back and locking him in steel restraints. Right at that very moment, Preston and Cynthia were shoved into the bridal suite by the furious general manager of the country club. Preston was sweating profusely, his expensive suit rumpled and his face pale with panic. The venue manager was shouting at the top of his lungs, demanding the $2 million wire transfer that had just bounced for the third consecutive time. He threatened to have Preston and Cynthia arrested for massive theft of services right there on the spot. Preston looked at his daughter in handcuffs, and then looked at Thomas, who was staring blankly at the floor. The horrible reality finally crashed down on the entire family. There was no money. There was no real estate collateral. There was absolutely no escape. The magnificent wedding they had orchestrated to cement their high society status had just become the scene of a massive federal takedown. The police officers marched Thomas and Victoria forward. They dragged the bride and groom out of the private suite and directly into the grand hallway of the country club. I walked slowly behind them alongside Mr. Sterling, watching the entire spectacular collapse unfold. The authorities marched them right past the massive archways of white roses and directly through the main reception hall. 200 wealthy elite guests stopped dead in their tracks. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room fell into an absolute horrified silence. The guests raised their smartphones, recording every single second of the humiliating spectacle as the bride in her heavily beaded designer gown and the groom in his custom tuxedo were marched out the front doors in handcuffs. Preston and Cynthia followed closely behind, hiding their faces in shame, surrounded by furious caterers and screaming florists demanding their money. The entire extravagant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving nothing but the undeniable truth exposed for the entire world to see. The sight of my son being escorted out of the Whispering Pines Country Club in handcuffs is an image that is permanently burned into my memory. Thomas walked with his head bowed so low that his chin rested on his chest, unable to meet the eyes of the 200 wealthy guests who were watching the entire spectacle unfold. Victoria stumbled beside him, her heavy designer gown dragging across the pristine marble floor. She was no longer the arrogant, demanding bride who had threatened to lock me away in a psychiatric ward just hours earlier. She was crying uncontrollably, a messy, broken display of pure panic as the federal investigators guided them toward the exit. They were both facing years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and felony forgery crimes they committed with absolute arrogance because they believed I was simply too weak to fight back. Behind them, the grand illusion of Victoria's family shattered completely. Her father Preston and her mother Cynthia were backed into a corner by the venue management and furious catering directors demanding the hundreds of thousands of dollars that had just bounced. The wealthy elite guests who had been sipping champagne and judging my modest navy dress were now whispering in absolute horror, pointing their smartphones at the disgraced family. The truth was out in the open. Victoria's family was entirely bankrupt, a hollow shell built on lies and unpaid debt. Their social ruin was absolute and irreversible. They had tried to steal my only home to fund their pathetic facade, and instead they had orchestrated their own devastating public destruction. I did not stay to watch the police cars drive away. I turned my back on the chaos and walked out the heavy oak doors into the warm afternoon sun. I got into my reliable 10-year-old sedan and drove away from the country club, leaving that toxic world of greed and manipulation in the rearview mirror forever. The drive back to my quiet neighborhood was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the 4-bedroom suburban home I had protected. It was not just a house. It was the sanctuary my husband and I had built with decades of honest hard work. It was my safety and my independence. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the profound silence of my home wrapped around me like a warm embrace. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a simple cup of tea. I sat at the island where I had spent countless hours grading student essays to pay for Thomas to go to college. I took a deep breath and allowed myself to feel the complex wave of emotions washing over me. There was pain, of course, a deep aching sorrow for the son I had lost. I mourned the boy he used to be, the young man I thought I had raised with strong morals and integrity. But that boy was gone, replaced by a stranger willing to sacrifice his own mother's survival for a taste of shallow wealth. Yet alongside that grief, there was an overwhelming sense of empowerment. I had stood my ground against a room full of predators, and I had won. I had refused to be a victim. I had refused to let them strip away my dignity and my legacy. For 40 years, I had given everything to my family, placing their needs above my own. But in the moment they demanded I surrender my very existence, I finally remembered my own worth. I remembered the brilliant financial empire my late husband had quietly built for me and the immense power it carried. A few weeks after the wedding catastrophe, I sat down with Mr. Sterling in his downtown office. We finalized the paperwork to permanently disinherit Thomas, removing him entirely from the blind trust and any future claims to my estate. He had made his choice when he forged my signature on federal bank documents, and he would now have to survive the harsh reality of those choices completely on his own. I decided to take the massive wealth my husband had left me and channel it into something meaningful. I established a multi-million-dollar educational foundation in my husband's name. The scholarship fund is dedicated to providing full university tuition for underprivileged, hardworking high school students. I wanted to help young people who truly valued education and understood the meaning of honest labor rather than handing another dime to entitled adults who believed the world owed them a luxurious living. My days are now filled with a serene, joyful routine. I spend my mornings reviewing scholarship applications from brilliant young minds, reading their essays, and seeing the bright futures ahead of them. I tend to my garden reading classic literature on my back porch and enjoying the quiet, absolute financial and emotional freedom I so fiercely protected. I no longer have to endure the condescending remarks of a materialistic daughter-in-law or watch my son abandon his character to please a shallow crowd. I am completely independent. If my story can teach you anything, let it be this. Never let anyone convince you that your kindness is a weakness. Never allow family members to use your love as a weapon to strip you of your security and your self-respect. Boundaries are not cruel, they are necessary for survival. You owe it to yourself to protect the life you have built, even if it means walking away from the people you once loved. True family is not simply a matter of shared blood. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional support. If those things are missing, you have every right to protect your peace and walk away. My name is Caroline. I am 68 years old, and I am the proud architect of my own incredibly bright future. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you found my journey inspiring, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories of strength and justice. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment down below and tell me where you are listening from. Until next time, stay strong and always remember your true worth.